So far for our week 2 discussion of both the readings and the idea of conceptualizing globalization, we have talked about ways that globalization impacts education. We have talked about ways of defining globalization related to education worldwide. We have talked about some phenomena that are a result of educational globalization. And now we're going to talk conceptually. Remember, this is Conceptualizing Globalization Week. We're going to talk conceptually a little bit about how nationalism and globalization are intertwined. And we're going to do that by looking at some ideas that come from this book, Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. Now, this is not a book that I have asked you to buy or read for this class this semester. However, it is a book that I have used in this class, I think, every other time I've taught it. It just is at the point where it's getting just old enough that I think it's a little bit outdated now. But some of the ideas, the ideas are actually fantastic. I actually have this older version of Imagined Communities that has, I think, a much better cover, much more interesting. Benedict Anderson was a professor of international studies at Cornell University. He's much more of an anthropologist than anything else, but he is a social anthropologist. And you'll enjoy this book quite a bit if you ever do read it for another class or you want to pick up a copy for yourself. I didn't do it for a class this time. Now, the last wave, there's actually a whole chapter in Imagined Communities that's dedicated to the last wave. And the idea of the last wave is that it is the last wave of nationalism. Because what Benedict Anderson is talking about in his Imagined Communities book is how nations are, in essence, imagined communities. And because of that imagined element to them, they're fluid, they're mobile, they can expand and contract. They don't have to be contiguous. There are lots of ideas related to a nation that would go along with our ideas about globalization nowadays. And the last wave of nationalism is post-World War II. So it's a historical look at how how nationalism has spread. It's also in this chapter of his book that he spends the most time focused on education specifically. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. And let me just read you first this quote from pages 139 to 140 of his book. He says that the origins of the last wave of nationalism, and I'm right up here. Oops. Get my pointer back. The origins of the last wave of nationalism lie in a response to new forms of global imperialism made possible by the achievements of industrial capitalism. Whew. All right. A lot of big words. Let's approach it as we have before. So we have global imperialism. Now this is certainly a way that a lot of people will think of globalization, because we did talk about it being a Western cultural account. We talked about the dominance of a particular legitimized formal education system, which does have its roots in a Western educated, industrialized, rich democracy, which is going to be capitalist, usually in its origin. Benedict Anderson argues that this global imperialism was made possible by industrial capitalism. Right? So we do also have this economic driver for globalization that's coming through here. In his case, the spread of nationalism as a way of thinking about globalization. But it has this economic driver to it, which we cannot seem to separate from our discussions of globalization anyway. He goes on to say that following Marx, the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeois over the face of the globe. Right? So this is the economic globalization as a result of capitalism. But he goes on to say that capitalism and its disseminations in print, and there's a whole interesting discussion that he has in Imagined Communities about print capitalism and how the idea of newspapers, you're going to look at me as if I'm crazy, but it's a very interesting discussion. The advent of newsprint actually did more to globalize thought than just about anything else. But anyway, he says, but capitalism and its disseminations in print helped create popular, vernacular, in other words, local discourse nationalisms in Europe, which undermined the old dynastic principle. So we have the idea that the last wave of nationalism is a way of thinking about our more contemporary, our more 21st century versions of how we define globalization. It has a global imperialism tinge to it. It is driven by capitalism and these sort of economic purposes. And it has this idea that we're creating a global version of popular but vernacular globalization. So what are some elements of the last wave that we want to talk about specifically in relation to education? Well, one is going to be the increase in physical mobility that was a result of the last wave of nationalism, according to Benedict Anderson. One will be the bureaucratization of the nation, or bureaucratization of the nation, or of education systems. And the other one will be just straight out the spread of what he calls postmodern educational systems. So let's take each of these in turn. First and foremost, he says, was the enormous increase in physical mobility made possible by the astonishing achievements of industrial capitalism. Railways and steamships in the last century, motor transport and aviation in this century. For him, the last century was the 19th century, and this century, when he wrote this, was the 20th century. Right? And we're still working with motor transport and aviation in the 21st century so far. So this kind of physical mobility is an incredibly important outcome or response to industrial capitalism and the globalization or the movement across boundaries that occurred as a result of that. Now, how did this influence education? Well, for one thing, it led to increased access to school. We can now get children into schools even when the schools aren't right around the corner from wherever they're living. So you can multiply the effects of education because now you have a way of actually getting school-aged people into the schools. Second of all, as a result of that mobility, there's also increased diversity in school, and it's something that's been hard fought, and it still isn't universal worldwide. But the increased diversity in schools in terms of races, ethnicities, socioeconomic status, language, you name it, a multitude of other things, gender, right? All of that is possible because of this increased physical mobility. It originally was, when there was a school, that school was for a particular community, and if you could walk to it, then it was your school. But usually people tend to gather in mono-ethnic or mono-economic communities. So middle-class people live with middle-class people. Elites live with elites. Whites live with whites. People from different ethnicities tend to gather together. What physical mobility did was break down some of those boundaries. People were now able to go outside of their own neighborhoods for education. Lastly, and I know this is hard to see, so let me see if I can shift this down a little bit so you can see it. Good. There's an increased option to select schools. So now we have the idea that families or students themselves, if there is this kind of mobility, they are not tied to their neighborhood school anymore. So if there's a school that might be better, that is farther away, maybe a car ride away or a train ride away, they have the option to do that. Now, why I have this in parentheses after that, which also leads to marginalization, why I've said that here, is because it's often those who have more advantages in terms of resources or decision-making authority who choose to make their children's schooling something that's farther away, who choose to be mobile about education. Those with more limited resources or limited educational decision-making authority tend to choose the local option. Right? So there is a marginalization effect that comes with this. Right? It's not all roses and flowers and unicorns and butterflies. There's something else that goes along with increased mobility that has more of a sinister side. Next, bureaucratization. Bureaucratization. That's a hard word for me to say, apparently. He says on page 121 that government schools formed a colossal, highly rationalized, tightly centered hierarchy, structurally analogous to the state bureaucracy itself. All right, let's break this down. Okay? So we have government schools, first of all, that are analogous to the state bureaucracy itself. Not surprising because they're often government-sponsored schools. So the legitimized formal education system that has spread worldwide, that has expanded all over the globe, is usually government-sponsored schooling. Now, I know that there's a lot of discussion we could have about privatization of education, but the basic legitimized institutionalized model is of a government-sponsored educational system. And that's why when we look at education worldwide, even if there's a privatized element to it, it's often regulated by the government somehow. Not saying this happens everywhere, but it is the norm. Right? So we have government schools that are analogous to a state bureaucracy themselves. And what they do is they form a colossal, that is one element of bureaucratization that we need to pay attention to. The idea that it is enormous. If you're going to have an educational system that is going to bring into it everyone, even if we limit it to everyone of school age, which is roughly what, 5 or 6 up until 17, 18, 19, depending on which system you're in, everyone for that incredibly long decade-and-a-half period in their lives, for the most developmentally appropriate or important stages of their lives. If you're going to bring everyone in other words, have a mass or a universal educational system, it is going to be enormous. And in order to manage that kind of enormity, you do need some sort of a structure. Bureaucratization tends to have been the way that that is handled. And what it ends up becoming is a rationalized system. Now, make no mistake that by assuming that rationalized means that it is appropriate or correct or right, or the best system. That's not what this means. Rationalized means that the ways that the education system has been institutionalized, the kind of curriculum, the ways that teachers are trained and what they do in their classrooms, the ways that schools are governed, are rationalized in that there is a technical and a functional purpose assigned to most things that happen in schools, even if it is a completely divorced purpose from what actually happens. Right? Again, that's another important idea, is that highly rationalized doesn't mean that the idea or the structure or the policy or the goal of the education system is actually what is realized. There's often a huge separation. So that in some countries, which you'll get enough of me in this class, so I won't go into this too much, some countries which have a very strong and overtly stated gender equality component to their educational policy and their educational systems are some of the most segregated by gender education systems in the world. So it's a highly rationalized gender equity policy, but a completely divorced idea of what actually happens in the schools in terms of separating boys and girls. Right? So we have this colossal, highly rationalized, next one, tightly centered hierarchy. So bureaucracies tend to work well in hierarchical structures because then you can have a governance and accountability system. Then you can have centralized decision making. Then you can have a system of checks and balances that goes with this rationalization or this rationalized structure. And it will look like the state bureaucracy itself, which might have a governor or a superintendent or a president or whomever at the top of that structure. And then people would sort of fan out under that organizational chart below it. So this means that we have increased governance of schools. The schools are going to fall under a centralized decision-making umbrella. Even in the most highly decentralized systems in the world, the United States would be a good one, where we still have a federal Department of Education. It is not as powerful as the national ministry or Department of Education in many countries, but it is going to be important in terms of influencing decision making. We have increased standardization of curriculum and teaching activity as a result of that colossal, highly rationalized, tightly centered hierarchy. And we have increased accountability of schools, teachers, and students for performance. And we talked about this a little earlier with the expansion of internationally comparative education data. But when you have a centralized decision-making function and standardized curriculum and teaching activity, the idea that there's going to be accountability tied to that will be even stronger, especially in a bureaucracy. We're going to pause here and come back with more on imagined communities in just a moment.